On a quiet bend of the Hudson River, where the water moves slowly and the hills rise with unnatural elegance, a stone castle watches from above. Its towers cut into the sky like something imported from another century, another continent. Lyndhurst Castle does not look American. It looks eternal. Visitors arrive expecting romance, aristocracy, and triumph. What they rarely sense at first glance is that this mansion was never a victory. It was a warning carved in stone. Because Lyndhurst is not the story of a home that made a man great. It is the story of a home so grand that it helped destroy the man who believed it could secure his legacy forever. In the Gilded Age, America's elite did not build houses. They built arguments. Every mansion was a declaration of power, taste, and permanence in a country still insecure about its place in the world. The Hudson River Valley became the chosen stage for this architectural war. Families competed not just in wealth but in visibility. Whoever commanded the river commanded history. Lyndhurst rises from this landscape as one of the most striking survivors of that era. A Gothic revival fantasy standing defiantly against time. But from the moment its towers were raised, Lyndhurst carried a quiet contradiction. Beauty without restraint. Ambition without an end. To understand why Lyndhurst would one day bankrupt its owner, you must first understand the illusion it was built to project. Stone walls suggest permanence. Towers suggest dominance. Castles suggest dynasties that endure for centuries. But in America, dynasties were new, fragile, and deeply anxious. Wealth arrived faster than identity. Men who controlled railroads, steel, and finance feared one thing more than poverty, being forgotten. Architecture became their defense against insignificance. Lyndhurst began its life not as a castle but as an experiment. In 1838, William Paulding Jr., former mayor of New York City, commissioned architect Alexander Jackson Davis to design a country estate unlike anything else in America. Gothic revival was radical, romantic, and intentionally anti-industrial. It rejected straight lines and practicality in favor of drama and symbolism. The house, originally called Knoll, was meant to impress, not comfort. Even then, the seeds were planted. Lyndhurst was never designed to be efficient. It was designed to be unforgettable. But Lyndhurst's true transformation and its eventual curse began decades later, when the estate fell into the hands of a man who understood power better than almost anyone in America, yet was despised for it. Jay Gould, railroad tycoon, Wall Street speculator, one of the richest men of the 19th century and one of the most hated. Gould made fortunes manipulating markets, crushing competitors, and bending laws to his advantage. He controlled vast empires of steel and rail, but socially, he remained an outsider. Old New York did not forgive his methods. Money could buy everything except acceptance. Lyndhurst became Gould's solution. If society would not open its doors to him, he would build a monument so overwhelming it could not be ignored. In 1880, Gould purchased the estate and began transforming it into the castle we see today. He did not expand Lyndhurst cautiously. He expanded it obsessively. Towers rose higher. Rooms multiplied. Details became more elaborate, more expensive, more excessive. The mansion became a physical extension of Gould's need to legitimize himself in a world that refused to forget how he made his money. From the river below, Lyndhurst looked like triumph. From inside, it became something else entirely. The estate demanded constant attention. Stone does not forgive neglect. Gothic ornamentation does not age quietly. Every addition increased maintenance, staffing, heating, and repair costs. Lyndhurst was not a finished project. It was a living expense, and the larger it grew, the more it consumed. The castle did not generate wealth. It devoured it. What makes Lyndhurst extraordinary is not its beauty but its appetite. Even for a man as wealthy as Jay Gould, the costs mounted relentlessly. This was the paradox of Gilded Age grandeur. The very structures meant to symbolize control and permanence created dependence. Once built, they could not be undone without humiliation. You could not downsize a castle. You could only surrender it, Standing today beneath its vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows, it is easy to romanticize Lyndhurst as a relic of elegance. But elegance was never its purpose. Lyndhurst was a weapon in a social war, and like many weapons, it ultimately turned on its owner. Jay Gould would die a rich man, but Lyndhurst ensured that his wealth was never free. It bound him to stone, staff, and endless expense. The castle outlived him, but it did not serve him. This is where the story truly begins. Because Lyndhurst Castle is not just a mansion. It is evidence. Evidence that in the old money world, greatness often comes with a hidden cost. Evidence that the pursuit of immortality through architecture can quietly hollow out the very legacy it is meant to protect. And as we move deeper into the story of Lyndhurst, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The castle survived. But it never stopped taking. The story of Lyndhurst Castle cannot be separated from the era that created it. Because Lyndhurst is not an anomaly of excess. It is a perfect product of its time. The Gilded Age was not simply a period of wealth. It was a period of acceleration. Between the end of the Civil War and the dawn of the 20th century, the United States transformed faster than any society in modern history. Railroads stitched the continent together, factories replaced farms, and fortunes appeared almost overnight. But while money moved at unprecedented speed, culture did not. America had wealth, but it did not yet have aristocracy. And that absence created a deep, restless insecurity among the men who suddenly controlled more capital than European nobility ever had. This insecurity shaped everything the elite touched, especially architecture. In Europe, power had centuries to harden into tradition. Castles, manors, and estates evolved slowly, accumulating meaning over generations. In America, the rich had no such luxury. They had to compress centuries of legitimacy into a single lifetime. Mansions became shortcuts to history. Stone towers replaced family lineage. Imported styles substituted for inherited prestige. The goal was not comfort. The goal was permanence. The Hudson River Valley became the perfect stage for this performance. Stretching north from New York City, the river offered beauty, proximity, and symbolism. Since colonial times, it had been associated with exploration, trade, and power. By the mid-19th century, it evolved into America's most exclusive address. To own land along the Hudson was to signal arrival at the highest level of society. Estates began to line its banks, each more ambitious than the last. Greek revival temples, Italianate villas, and Gothic fantasies rose from the hills, competing silently with one another for dominance of the landscape. This competition was not subtle. It was deliberate. Wealthy industrialists did not merely want privacy. They wanted visibility. Their estates were placed to be seen from the river, from passing boats, from rival properties across the water. Architecture became a language of intimidation. Bigger meant stronger. Older styles implied deeper roots. European influence suggested refinement that American industry alone could not provide. In this environment, restraint was interpreted as weakness. The Gilded Age elite lived under constant pressure to prove themselves. Many of these men, railroad barons, financiers, oil magnates, had risen from modest or unstable backgrounds. They remembered insecurity. They remembered being dismissed. Their wealth did not erase those memories. It amplified them. Mansions became armor. Stone walls protected not just families, but egos. And like all armor, the heavier it became, the more it restricted the wearer. Lyndhurst emerged within this culture of excess as both participant and outlier. Gothic revival architecture was particularly revealing of the Gilded Age psyche. Unlike classical styles which emphasized order and balance, Gothic revival leaned into drama, mystery, and emotional weight. Pointed arches, asymmetry, towers, and ornamentation evoked medieval Europe, a world of feudal power and unquestioned hierarchy. For American elites, this style offered something irresistible, the illusion of ancient authority in a nation, barely a century old. Choosing Gothic revival was a declaration. It said this family did not merely possess wealth. It possessed gravity. It implied endurance beyond markets and generations. But Gothic revival was also impractical. Its beauty depended on complexity. Its maintenance demanded constant attention. Stone facades weathered harshly. Ornamental details required skilled labor. Heating vast, irregular interiors was inefficient and costly. These buildings were designed to impress, not to function economically. The Gilded Age ignored this reality because it could afford to. Or at least it believed it could. Fortunes seemed endless. Railroads expanded. Stocks climbed. New industries replaced old ones before collapse could be fully felt. But this confidence masked a dangerous assumption that wealth once achieved was permanent. Mansions like Lyndhurst were built on that assumption. They were monuments to uninterrupted prosperity. Yet beneath the surface, the Gilded Age was unstable. Financial panic struck with regularity. Labor unrest spread as workers pushed back against extreme inequality. Political corruption eroded trust. The same industrial systems that generated immense wealth also produced volatility. For every success story, there were bankruptcies, scandals, and sudden falls from grace. The mansions, however, remained. They could not adapt. They could not shrink. They demanded the same resources regardless of circumstance. This is the environment into which Jay Gould stepped when he acquired Lyndhurst. By the time he entered the Hudson River elite, the unwritten rules were already established. A man's estate was read as a reflection of his moral and social worth. Gould, widely vilified as a manipulator and speculator, understood this better than anyone. His fortune alone would never be enough. To be taken seriously, he needed architectural proof. But Gould also inherited the Gilded Age's greatest flaw, the belief that scale could solve insecurity. Each addition to Lyndhurst made sense within the logic of the era. Bigger rooms meant greater status. More elaborate details meant refined taste. Taller towers meant dominance over the landscape. No single decision seemed reckless. The danger lay in accumulation. The mansion grew the way fortunes did, incrementally, relentlessly, without pause for reflection. Across the Hudson Valley, similar stories unfolded. The Vanderbilts constructed palaces so vast, they required entire villages of staff. The Morgans filled their estates with priceless art to legitimize financial power. The Astors clung to lineage through architecture, long after their social dominance faded. Many of these families would later abandon their estates, unable or unwilling to sustain them. Some properties were demolished. Others were sold, subdivided, or surrendered to preservation societies. The pattern was consistent. Grandeur outpaced sustainability. What makes Lyndhurst unique is how clearly it embodies this contradiction. It is not merely large. It is symbolically heavy. Every tower, every window, every decorative flourish adds weight, not just physically, but financially and psychologically. The mansion demands reverence. It does not adapt to modern life. It resists change. In doing so, it reveals the central tension of the Gilded Age, the desire for permanence in a society defined by change. The Gilded Age elite believed they were building the future. In reality, they were freezing themselves in time. Their mansions captured a moment of peak confidence, a moment when it seemed possible to turn money into immortality. But history does not reward rigidity. It punishes it. As tastes shifted and economies evolved, these estates became relics of a mindset that no longer fit the world around them. Lyndhurst's survival into the modern era is often interpreted as success. But survival alone is not proof of wisdom. The mansion endures because institutions stepped in where individuals could not. Preservation replaced ownership. History replaced ambition. Lyndhurst no longer functions as a declaration of power. It functions as a lesson. Section 2, then, is not about architecture alone. It is about psychology. It is about a generation that believes stone could compensate for insecurity and scale could guarantee significance. Lyndhurst Castle stands as a physical record of that belief. Its beauty is undeniable. Its cost was enormous. And embedded within its walls is the story of an era that mistook excess for stability. and permanence for safety. To understand why Lyndhurst would one day bankrupt its owner, we must first accept this truth. The Gilded Age did not create mansions because it was confident. It created them because it was afraid. Afraid of being forgotten. Afraid of being exposed. Afraid that without visible proof, wealth alone would not be enough. Lyndhurst was built to silence those fears. Instead, it preserved them in stone. Long before Lyndhurst Castle became a Gothic monument to Gilded Age excess, it began as something far more restrained, though no less revealing of American ambition. In 1838, the land overlooking the Hudson River was purchased by William Paulding, Jr., a former mayor of New York City and a man deeply conscious of status, taste, and legacy. Paulding did not belong to the later industrial elite who would define the Gilded Age, but he represented an earlier American aristocracy, political, civic, and self-fashioned. His decision to build on this elevated stretch of riverbank was deliberate. The Hudson was already becoming a symbolic corridor of power, and Paulding understood that landscape itself could confer authority. What he envisioned was not merely a country house, but a statement that aligned him with refinement rather than commerce, permanence rather than politics. To bring this vision to life, Paulding turned to Alexander Jackson Davis, one of the most influential architects in early 19th century America. Davis was not simply a designer of buildings. He was a translator of European Romanticism into an American context. At a time when most American homes still followed rigid classical forms, Davis was experimenting with asymmetry, ornamentation, and emotional architecture. He believed buildings should evoke feeling, not just function. For Paulding, this approach was ideal. The estate, originally called Knoll, would not resemble the orderly temples of Greek revival popular among businessmen and bankers. It would instead evoke mystery, culture, and imagination. When construction was completed, Knoll stood apart from anything else along the Hudson. Its pointed arches, irregular roof lines, and dramatic silhouette marked one of the earliest examples of Gothic revival, architecture used for a private residence in the United States. This choice was radical. Gothic revival was associated with medieval Europe, with cathedrals, monasteries, and aristocratic estates rooted in centuries of tradition. To adopt this style in a young republic was to make a bold claim that American identity did not need to be practical or restrained, but could be poetic and symbolic. Paulding's house did not shout wealth. It whispered intellect and taste, yet even in its earliest form, the estate carried the DNA of excess. Gothic revival architecture was inherently inefficient. Its beauty depended on complexity. Every irregular angle, every decorative flourish required more labor, more material, and more long-term care. Knoll was not designed to be easily heated, cheaply repaired, or quickly modified. It was designed to endure visually, not economically. Paulding could afford this, but only barely. The estate stretched his finances, and within a few years, the cost of maintaining such an unconventional residence began to outweigh its prestige. By the 1840s, Paulding's financial position weakened. The mansion that had elevated his status now threatened it. In 1843, he sold the property to merchant George Merritt, a man whose wealth came from trade rather than politics. Merritt renamed the estate Lindenhurst, later shortened to Lyndhurst, and began expanding it almost immediately. This transition marked a critical shift. Under Paulding, the house was an artistic experiment. Under Merritt, it became a status project. Merritt retained Alexander Jackson Davis and tasked him with enlarging the estate, reinforcing its Gothic character while making it grander and more imposing. This second phase of construction revealed something important about Lyndhurst's evolution. Each owner did not simply inhabit the house. They reshaped it to reflect their insecurities and ambitions. Merritt's additions were not strictly necessary. They were expressive. Towers grew taller. Interiors became more elaborate. The house began to transform from a refined country residence into something approaching a castle. And with every expansion, Lyndhurst moved further away from being a home and closer to becoming a symbol. Merritt, however, would not enjoy Lyndhurst for long. In a cruel irony that would later echo through the estate's history, He died suddenly in 1856, only a year after completing major renovations. His widow sold the property shortly thereafter. Lyndhurst had once again proven itself a magnificent object that outlasted its owner's ability to control it. The pattern was beginning to form long before Jay Gould ever set foot on the grounds. By the time Lyndhurst entered its next phase of ownership, it had already developed a reputation. It was admired, discussed, and remembered. Travelers along the Hudson recognized its silhouette instantly. Artists sketched it. Writers referenced it. The mansion had achieved what it was always meant to achieve, visibility. But visibility comes with consequence. A house that commands attention invites comparison. Each successive owner inherited not just the building, but the pressure to justify it. This is what Jay Gould encountered when he purchased Lyndhurst in 1880. He did not acquire a blank canvas. He acquired a narrative already in motion. The estate carried expectations, history, and a growing symbolic weight. Gould, a man obsessed with control, would attempt to dominate that narrative. But Lyndhurst was already larger than any one individual. Its evolution had been shaped by multiple ambitions layered over decades. Gould would not simplify it. He would amplify it. Understanding Lyndhurst's origins is essential to understanding its eventual role as a financial burden. The mansion was never the product of restraint. From its first stones, it was an architectural indulgence rooted in romantic ideals rather than practical needs. Each owner treated it not as a place to live efficiently, but as a reflection of self. Over time, those reflections accumulated. The house became crowded with ambition, taste, insecurity, and legacy, all built into its walls. Alexander Jackson Davis's influence cannot be overstated. His genius gave Lyndhurst its haunting beauty, but his philosophy also ensured its impracticality. Davis believed architecture should inspire awe and emotion. He succeeded. Lyndhurst does both effortlessly, but always expensive. Emotion requires maintenance. What Davis created was timeless in appearance, but fragile in sustainability. By the late 19th century, Lyndhurst was no longer just a house that happened to be expensive. It was expensive because of what it symbolized. It represented artistic daring, social aspiration, and the desire to appear rooted in history rather than exposed to modern volatility. These values resonated deeply with men like Jay Gould, who understood that reputation could be as valuable as capital. But reputation, unlike money, could not be easily liquidated. Section 3 reveals that Lyndhurst's fate was not the result of a single reckless owner. It was the cumulative outcome of decades of architectural ambition layered without restraint. Each owner believed they were elevating the estate. In reality, they were increasing its demands. Lyndhurst did not become a burden overnight. It became one incrementally, beautifully, and inevitably, before it bankrupted its most famous owner. Lyndhurst perfected a dangerous illusion. That beauty justified cost. That symbolism excused excess, and that permanence could be achieved through stone alone. These ideas were embedded into the mansion long before the Gilded Age reached its peak. By the time Jay Gould arrived, Lyndhurst was already a masterpiece and already a liability waiting for someone wealthy enough to fully experience its consequences. When Jay Gould acquired Lyndhurst in 1880, he did not simply purchase a mansion overlooking the Hudson River. He acquired a stage upon which he intended to rewrite his place in American history. By that point, Gould was already one of the most powerful men in the country, yet he remained one of the most despised. Newspapers labeled him a robber baron, a manipulator, a parasite on the American economy. His fortune, vast beyond comprehension, was viewed not as evidence of genius, but as proof of moral failure. Gould understood something that few of his contemporaries admitted openly. In America, money alone did not confer legitimacy. Acceptance had to be performed. Jay Gould's rise was ruthless, calculated, and efficient. Born in 1836 to a modest family in upstate New York, he learned early that sentiment was a liability. He entered business with a cold clarity that allowed him to exploit weakness wherever he found it. Railroads became his instrument of dominance. By manipulating stocks, consolidating lines, and crushing rivals, he assembled an empire that connected vast stretches of the nation. But his methods created enemies as quickly as they created wealth. Unlike the Vanderbilts or the Morgans, Gould was never embraced by society's inner circles. He was tolerated for his power, feared for his influence, and despised for his tactics. This social isolation cut deeper than public criticism. Gould was not driven by admiration. He was driven by exclusion. He understood that no amount of success in markets could secure a place in the American aristocracy if his reputation remained untamed. Lyndhurst offered a solution that money alone could not. Architecture had the power to communicate refinement, permanence, and cultural authority without requiring approval. A castle did not ask permission to exist. It imposed itself. The purchase of Lyndhurst marked a turning point in Gould's personal strategy. He did not select the estate for comfort or retreat. He selected it for visibility. The mansion's position above the Hudson made it unavoidable. Anyone traveling the river would see it. Anyone of status in New York society would know its name. Lyndhurst was already admired for its Gothic elegance. Under Gould's ownership, it would become impossible to ignore. Almost immediately, Gould resumed construction. He rehired Alexander Jackson Davis, the architect who had shaped Lyndhurst's earlier incarnations, and instructed him to expand the estate further. These expansions were not minor renovations. They were declarations. Towers grew taller. Rooms multiplied. Decorative elements became more intricate and expensive. Gould did not seek subtlety. He sought dominance through scale. This approach mirrored how Gould operated in business. He believed that control came from overwhelming force. In railroads, this meant monopolies and consolidations. At Lyndhurst, it meant architectural saturation. The estate became a reflection of his worldview. Complexity as strength, size as security, visibility as power. Every stone added to Lyndhurst reinforced the message that Gould was not temporary. He was immovable. Yet the irony of Gould's ambition was that the very society he sought to impress interpreted his architectural grandeur with suspicion. Old New York valued lineage and restraint. Excess was seen as vulgar, especially when practiced by men whose wealth was newly minted and morally contested. Lyndhurst's growing magnificence did not soften Gould's image. In many ways, it hardened it. The castle became a symbol of his defiance rather than his refinement. Inside Lyndhurst, life was paradoxical. Despite its vastness, the estate was emotionally austere. Gould was rarely present, consumed by his business dealings. When he was there, the house functioned more like a headquarters than a home. Meetings took precedence over intimacy. Decisions echoed louder than laughter. The children who grew up within its walls experienced luxury without warmth, space without freedom. Lyndhurst, for all its beauty, was not a refuge. It was a projection. The costs of maintaining this projection were immense. Gothic revival architecture, with its towers, turrets, and elaborate stonework, required constant care. Roofs leaked. Stone eroded. Decorative elements weathered quickly. Heating the mansion during harsh New York winters consumed vast quantities of fuel. Staff was needed not just for comfort, but for preservation. Lyndhurst demanded an army of servants, gardeners, craftsmen, and caretakers simply to remain functional. For Jay Gould, these expenses were manageable, but only because his wealth was continually replenished by relentless business activity. The mansion tied his personal life to his financial aggression. He could not afford to slow down. To step back from his empire would have meant risking the very resources that sustained Lyndhurst. In this way, the house became an invisible chain. It did not bankrupt him outright. It ensured that rest was impossible. Publicly, Lyndhurst achieved exactly what Gould intended. It became inseparable from his name. Newspapers described it in reverent tones. Visitors marveled at its grandeur. The mansion asserted his presence in a social world that had otherwise rejected him. But acceptance never followed. Gould remained an outsider, tolerated but not embraced. Lyndhurst had amplified his power, not softened his image. This failure revealed a fundamental misunderstanding. Gould believed legitimacy could be built. Old New York believed legitimacy had to be inherited. No amount of stone could erase the methods by which his fortune was made. Lyndhurst, rather than redeeming him, became evidence of the very excess that critics used against him. As Gould aged, the tension between his empire and his estate intensified. Financial panics threatened his holdings. Labor unrest challenged his railroads. The pressure to maintain control grew heavier each year. Lyndhurst, immovable and unyielding, stood as a constant reminder of the life he had chosen. It demanded continuity. It punished vulnerability. When Jay Gould died in 1892 at the age of 56, he left behind one of the largest fortunes in American history. But he also left behind Lyndhurst, a property whose scale and cost would soon reveal themselves as a liability rather than an asset. The castle had fulfilled its role as a symbol. It had failed as a legacy. Section 4 marks the moment when Lyndhurst's destiny became irreversible. Under Jay Gould, the estate reached its architectural peak and its psychological limit. What began as a romantic experiment became a monument to ambition unchecked. Gould conquered markets, but Lyndhurst conquered him in subtler ways. It bound him to endless expansion, endless maintenance, endless proof. The mansion stands today as a testament to that contradiction. Jay Gould built Lyndhurst to secure his place among America's elite. Instead, it exposed the limits of power without belonging. In Stone and Shadow, Lyndhurst tells the story of a man who could dominate everything except perception, and of a castle that demanded everything in return. By the time Lyndhurst entered its most dramatic phase of expansion, it was no longer guided by architectural curiosity or residential need. It was driven by something far more dangerous: momentum. Under Jay Gould, the mansion ceased to be a place that evolved organically and became a project that could never be finished. Every completed addition revealed another perceived inadequacy, another opportunity to assert scale, taste, and dominance. Lyndhurst was no longer responding to function. It was responding to insecurity, and insecurity has no natural stopping point. Gould's decision to dramatically expand Lyndhurst was rooted in the same logic that governed his financial empire. In business, he believed consolidation created safety. The larger and more complex the system, the harder it was for rivals to dismantle. He applied this philosophy directly to architecture. The mansion became a physical manifestation of control through accumulation. Towers rose not because they were needed, but because they could rise. Rooms multiplied not for family life, but to demonstrate capacity. Lyndhurst was transformed into a monument whose primary audience was not its inhabitants, but the world beyond its gates. Alexander Jackson Davis, now nearing the end of his career, returned to Lyndhurst to oversee this transformation. His earlier work had emphasized romantic asymmetry and artistic restraint within the Gothic revival style. Under Gould's direction, restraint disappeared. The design grew heavier, more elaborate, more demanding. Davis delivered exactly what was asked of him: a castle that would rival Europe's great estates in presence if not in age. But the cost of this achievement was not merely financial. It was structural. The mansion's complexity increased exponentially, locking it into a permanent state of dependence. Lyndhurst's interiors became theatrical. Grand halls stretched longer, ceilings soared higher, windows grew taller and more ornate. Stained glass filtered light in dramatic patterns that prioritized mood over illumination. Fireplaces multiplied, not as sources of warmth, but as symbols of abundance. Every choice emphasized spectacle. But spectacle comes with obligations. Each element required specialized care, constant cleaning, and frequent repair. Gothic beauty does not age quietly. It demands attention. Outside, the grounds expanded alongside the house. Formal lawns, carriage drives, terraces, and gardens were meticulously designed to complement the castle's dominance. Landscaping became another layer of expense, another system requiring labor and upkeep. Trees were planted strategically to frame views of the Hudson, not to provide shade or utility. Nature itself was curated into submission. The estate became a controlled environment, beautiful and artificial, requiring continuous intervention to remain so. what made Lyndhurst particularly dangerous as an investment was its refusal to stabilize. Most homes, even large ones, reach a point of equilibrium where maintenance becomes predictable. Lyndhurst never did. Its ongoing expansion meant that new systems were constantly being added, each with its own vulnerabilities. Roof lines intersected awkwardly. Drainage became complicated. Heating vast stone rooms proved inefficient. The mansion grew outward and upward without regard for long-term sustainability. This was not ignorance. Gould understood costs. He monitored details obsessively in business. But Lyndhurst existed outside rational accounting. It was not meant to make sense on paper. It was meant to perform psychologically. It reassured Gould that his power had a physical anchor. That reassurance was expensive, but he could afford it so long as his empire remained intact. The deeper problem was that Lyndhurst transformed expense into obligation. Once the castle reached a certain scale, it could not be neglected without immediate and visible consequences. Stone cracked. Water infiltrated. Ornamental details deteriorated. A house of this size did not forgive delay. Maintenance was not optional. It was continuous. Lyndhurst demanded loyalty in the form of resources. For Gould's family, the mansion became increasingly oppressive. It was too large to feel intimate, too symbolic to feel relaxed. Rooms echoed. Corridors stretched endlessly. Privacy was paradoxically difficult to achieve in a house so vast. Servants were always present. The estate functioned like an institution rather than a residence. Children grew up surrounded by grandeur but emotionally isolated. Their lives shaped by schedules, staff, and expectations rather than warmth. Socially, Lyndhurst remained a contradiction. Despite its magnificence, it did not become a center of elite society. Gould hosted events, but they lacked the effortless legitimacy of old families. Guests came out of curiosity, not belonging. The mansion impressed, but it did not integrate. This failure intensified the need to expand further, to refine more aggressively, to perfect what could not be perfected. Every addition to Lyndhurst was an attempt to close a gap that architecture alone could not bridge. Gould was chasing an acceptance that could not be constructed. Yet the castle continued to grow, absorbing time, money, and attention that might otherwise have softened his public image through philanthropy or restraint. Lyndhurst did not balance his reputation. It amplified its extremes. Financially, the estate represented a constant drain. While Gould's wealth was immense, it was not static. It depended on active management, risk, and expansion. Lyndhurst tethered him to this cycle. To slow down would have been to threaten the resources that sustained the house. In this way, the mansion dictated the rhythm of his life. It did not bankrupt him outright, but it ensured that withdrawal was impossible. As the 1880s progressed, Lyndhurst reached a scale that even Gould could not ignore. The estate no longer symbolized security. It symbolized exposure. It was too visible, too costly, too demanding to be quietly managed. It stood as a constant reminder that power, once displayed, must be continually defended. What makes Section 5 crucial is the realization that Lyndhurst did not collapse under a single financial blow. It eroded value slowly, relentlessly, through maintenance, staffing, and expectation. The mansion was not a mistake in design. It was a mistake in philosophy. It assumed continuity where none was guaranteed. It assumed that wealth, once achieved, could be preserved indefinitely through stone. By turning Lyndhurst into a monument rather than a home, Gould crossed the threshold. The estate stopped serving him and began consuming him. It demanded expansion when caution was needed. It demanded display when restraint might have altered perception. Lyndhurst became a machine that converted money into symbolism at an unsustainable rate. In the end, the transformation of Lyndhurst into a monument revealed the fatal flaw of Gilded Age ambition. Grandeur is not neutral. It imposes obligations. It narrows options. It locks individuals into patterns of behavior that prioritize appearance over adaptability. Lyndhurst did exactly what it was designed to do. It made Jay Gould unforgettable. What it could not do was protect him or his family from the cost of being remembered this way. Section 5 closes with Lyndhurst at its peak, magnificent and complete, yet already past the point of safety. The castle stands flawless in appearance, but beneath its towers lies an invisible deficit, growing quietly with every season. From this moment forward, Lyndhurst is no longer merely expensive. It is inevitable. Once Lyndhurst reached its full architectural form, the true cost of the castle began to reveal itself not in dramatic financial collapse, but in relentless, invisible attrition. This was the phase no architect could romanticize and no visitor could easily see. The towers no longer rose. The rooms no longer multiplied. What remained was maintenance, and maintenance is where grand ambition quietly goes to die. Lyndhurst had crossed a threshold. It no longer needed vision. It needed endurance. Gothic revival architecture, for all its drama, is unforgiving over time. Stone weathers. Mortar weakens. Roof lines with complex angles invite leaks. Ornamental elements crack under frost and heat. Lyndhurst's beauty was built on intricacy, and intricacy multiplies failure points. Every winter tested the castle's defenses. Every spring revealed new damage. Repairs were not occasional. They were constant. What appeared timeless from a distance required perpetual intervention up close. Heating, Lyndhurst alone was a monumental challenge. Vast stone rooms with soaring ceilings resisted warmth. Fireplaces, though numerous, were inefficient and symbolic rather than practical. Fuel consumption was enormous, especially during New York's long winters. Coal had to be delivered in large quantities, stored, managed, and burned continuously. The cost of keeping the castle habitable during colder months rivaled the annual expenses of entire households in the city below. Staffing compounded the burden. Lyndhurst could not function without a large, specialized workforce. Servants maintained daily operations, but beyond them were gardeners, stable hands, engineers, masons, glaziers, and carpenters. Many of these workers were not employed seasonally but year-round. The estate was a small economy unto itself. Wages, housing, food, and supervision all became permanent line items. Reducing staff risked decay. Maintaining staff ensured expense. Unlike businesses, Lyndhurst had no revenue stream. It produced nothing. It did not appreciate in a way that could be realized without surrendering it. The castle consumed resources without replenishing them. This imbalance was manageable during periods of aggressive wealth accumulation. It became dangerous during uncertainty. Lyndhurst required stability in a world defined by volatility. For Jay Gould, this dependency reinforced a pattern already present in his life. He could never disengage. His railroads demanded constant attention, constant defense against rivals and regulators. Lyndhurst mirrored this demand. The castle became another system requiring control, another front that could not be abandoned. Leisure, often associated with great estates, was an illusion here. Lyndhurst offered no rest. It extended the battlefield into private life. Psychologically, the weight of maintenance altered the meaning of ownership. What once symbolized achievement became a source of pressure. Gould was acutely aware that neglect would be visible and interpreted as weakness. A cracked tower or deteriorating facade would not go unnoticed by critics eager to declare decline. Lyndhurst forced performance long after performance ceased to provide satisfaction. For the family, the consequences were subtler but profound. Life inside the castle revolved around logistics rather than comfort. Rooms were closed in winter to conserve heat. Entire wings became unusable during repairs. Noise from constant work disrupted privacy. The house never settled into routine. It remained perpetually unfinished in practice, if not in design. The mansion was always being maintained, adjusted, corrected. This constant state of upkeep eroded the emotional relationship between the family and the estate. Lyndhurst did not feel lived in. It felt managed. Children navigated a world governed by schedules, staff protocols, and spatial hierarchy. Intimacy was difficult in a house designed to impress rather than shelter. The scale that inspired awe from outsiders created distance within. As the 1880s progressed, the broader economic landscape grew more unstable. Financial panics loomed. Markets fluctuated. Railroads, though profitable, were increasingly scrutinized and regulated. Gould's wealth remained immense, but it was no longer invulnerable. Lyndhurst, unchanged in its demands, became increasingly out of sync with reality. The castle did not adjust to uncertainty. It intensified it. Maintenance costs did not decline during downturns. They often increased. Deferred repairs compounded. Emergency fixes were more expensive than preventative care. Lyndhurst punished hesitation. It required proactive investment regardless of circumstance. This rigidity was its greatest flaw. Unlike capital, it could not be redeployed. Unlike businesses, it could not be scaled down. The illusion of permanence began to crack. Lyndhurst, built to symbolize stability, was revealed as dependent. Its survival relied on constant infusion of resources. Without them, decay was immediate and visible. The castle demanded attention not just financially but mentally. It occupied space in decision-making that could not be ignored. When Jay Gould's health declined in the early 1890s, the pressure intensified. Illness did not pause the needs of the estate. Lyndhurst continued to demand care even as its owner weakened. This imbalance underscored the ultimate truth of monumental living. The monument outlives the man. But it does not wait for him. Gould's death in 1892 marked a turning point, but not a resolution. He left behind vast wealth, but also vast obligations. Lyndhurst passed to his heirs not as a prize, but as a responsibility. The castle did not come with instructions for emotional attachment. It came with invoices. For the next generation, the cost of Lyndhurst became more visible and less justifiable. The mansion was a relic of a mindset that no longer fit the emerging century. Tastes shifted. Practicality gained value. Excess lost its moral cover. What had once signaled power now signaled stubbornness. Section 6 exposes the silent phase of decline that precedes every grand fall. Lyndhurst did not collapse in scandal or ruin. It eroded under its own weight. Maintenance transformed beauty into burden. What was built to project permanence revealed its dependence. The castle demanded loyalty long after it stopped offering protection. This is where Lyndhurst's role in bankrupting its owner becomes clear. It did not drain accounts suddenly. It drained flexibility. It narrowed options. It locked resources into stone when adaptability was needed most. Lyndhurst was not an error in construction. It was an error in belief. The belief that once you build greatness, it will take care of itself. In reality, greatness requires constant feeding. And eventually the feeding becomes unsustainable. Lyndhurst reached that moment quietly, without drama, without collapse, just an unending series of demands that transformed triumph into obligation. By the time Lyndhurst entered its seventh phase of existence, the castle was no longer defined by ambition or even maintenance, but by inheritance. This is the most dangerous stage for any great estate because inheritance removes intention. Jay Gould had built Lyndhurst with a ruthless clarity of purpose. It was an extension of his will, his psychology, his need to dominate both landscape and narrative. When he died, that animating force vanished. What remained was stone without strategy. The transfer of Lyndhurst to Gould's heirs exposed a fundamental truth about Gilded Age wealth. Fortunes could be divided, but monuments could not. The castle did not fragment neatly among beneficiaries. It remained whole, immovable, demanding unified commitment in a family that no longer shared a unified vision. What had once been a symbol of one man's control became a test of collective tolerance. Gould's children inherited immense financial assets, but they also inherited an era that was turning against the very values that had built Lyndhurst. The late 19th century was closing. The progressive era was rising. Public sentiment was shifting away from robber barons and toward reform, regulation, and social accountability. Extravagance was no longer admired uncritically. It was scrutinized. Lyndhurst, once a statement of power, now risked becoming evidence. For the heirs, the castle posed an immediate practical dilemma. Selling it was not simple. The pool of buyers capable of purchasing and maintaining such an estate was shrinking rapidly. Industrial wealth was becoming more liquid, more mobile, less tied to land. The new elite preferred penthouses, not castles. Country estates were liabilities disguised as prestige. Attempting to keep Lyndhurst intact required ongoing financial commitment at a time when diversification and flexibility were increasingly necessary. The estate demanded resources without contributing to growth. It produced no income, no leverage, no strategic advantage. It was capital frozen in stone. In a modernizing economy, this was a dangerous position. Emotionally, Lyndhurst was equally problematic. For Jay Gould, the castle had been personal. For his heirs, it was inherited symbolism without lived memory. They did not build it. They did not fight for it. They did not associate it with personal triumph. This emotional distance weakened loyalty. The castle became an obligation rather than an achievement. Daily life at Lyndhurst continued, but with subtle changes. Rooms were closed more frequently. Staff numbers fluctuated. Repairs were delayed. These were not signs of collapse, but of recalibration. The estate was being slowly downsized in practice, even if its silhouette remained unchanged. This quiet retreat marked the beginning of decline. Financial pressures accumulated not through catastrophe, but through friction. Taxes increased. Labor costs rose. Regulations multiplied. The cost of doing nothing grew higher every year. Lyndhurst required decisions, and indecision proved costly. Every postponed repair compounded future expense. Every season of partial use accelerated wear. The heirs faced an uncomfortable paradox. To preserve Lyndhurst as their father had envisioned required a level of centralized authority and risk tolerance that no longer existed. But to dismantle it would appear as betrayal. The castle trapped them between reverence and realism. This tension played out in incremental compromises. Portions of the estate were leased. Events were hosted. The boundaries between private residence and public spectacle began to blur. Lyndhurst was quietly transitioning from home to asset, from symbol to instrument. This shift was subtle but irreversible. As the 20th century approached, the broader social context further undermined Lyndhurst's viability. The rise of income tax transformed large estates from passive holdings into active liabilities. Wealth preservation now required strategy, not display. Lyndhurst was optimized for display. The Great War loomed on the horizon, reshaping priorities even before it began. National identity, industrial mobilization, and economic efficiency became dominant concerns. Castles on the Hudson felt increasingly anachronistic. The world was accelerating. Lyndhurst was static. Within the family, generational differences intensified the strain. Younger members viewed the estate pragmatically. Older ones viewed it sentimentally. These perspectives rarely aligned. Decision-making slowed. Consensus became elusive. The castle lingered in a state of suspended purpose. The idea that Lyndhurst might need to be surrendered, sold, repurposed, or institutionalized began to surface quietly. Not as failure, but as inevitability. The realization was gradual and painful. The castle had outlived the conditions that justified its existence. Here lies the deeper mechanism by which Lyndhurst bankrupted its owner, not just financially, but temporally. It locked wealth into a past that no longer produced returns in the present. It anchored decision-makers to outdated frameworks. It consumed attention that could have been deployed elsewhere. Even when resources remained sufficient, the opportunity cost became impossible to ignore. Every dollar spent on Lyndhurst was a dollar not invested in emerging industries, new technologies, or adaptive ventures. The castle siphoned not just money, but momentum. By this stage, Lyndhurst had become a monument to sunk cost. The more that had been invested, the harder it became to let go. The logic was circular and destructive. Preservation justified further expenditure, which in turn demanded preservation. This feedback loop is fatal to adaptability. Public perception also shifted. What had once inspired awe now provoked curiosity tinged with judgment. Visitors no longer saw Lyndhurst as proof of genius. They saw it as evidence of excess. The narrative surrounding the estate changed, and narratives matter. They influence value, legitimacy, and pride. Eventually, the question was no longer whether Lyndhurst could be maintained as originally intended, but whether it should be. This is the point at which monuments lose their power. When justification erodes, stone becomes weight. Section 7 marks the moment when Lyndhurst ceased to be a private dream and began its transformation into a public artifact. Not yet a museum, not yet a ruin, but no longer a living ambition. It occupied a liminal state, sustained by inertia rather than desire. The tragedy here is quiet and structural. No scandal, no fire, no dramatic foreclosure. Just the slow realization that the castle had won. It had consumed enough resources, attention, and flexibility to ensure that its owners would eventually have to surrender control. Lyndhurst did not bankrupt its owner in a single moment. It bankrupted a philosophy. The belief that permanence equals security. The belief that stone can outlast change. The belief that grandeur can insulate against time. As the family edged towards solutions that would once have seemed unthinkable, the castle stood unchanged, indifferent. It had always been this way. It had never adapted. It had only endured. And endurance without purpose is not strength. It is inertia. What comes next is not collapse, but conversion. Lyndhurst will survive, but not as it was intended. The cost of its survival will be the abandonment of its original meaning. In the next section, we will witness how a private fortress becomes a public relic, and how surrender, rather than destruction, becomes the final strategy for saving what could no longer be owned. By the time Lyndhurst entered its 8th transformation, the question was no longer how to preserve it, but how to justify its continued existence. This is the stage at which great private monuments either vanish quietly or reinvent themselves entirely. Lyndhurst chose the latter not out of vision, but out of necessity. The castle had become too expensive to live in, too famous to abandon, and too symbolic to demolish. What remained was conversion. The early 20th century was merciless to inherited grandeur. The social contract that had protected Gilded Age wealth was unraveling. Progressive reforms targeted excess. Estate taxes tightened their grip. Public opinion hardened against idle luxury. Lyndhurst, towering above the Hudson like a relic of a defeated empire, stood exposed. Its very visibility made it vulnerable. To remain private was to invite criticism. To remain empty was to invite decay. The castle needed a new role. This is where ideology quietly replaces ownership. The logic shifts from "this is ours" to "this must be saved." Preservation becomes a moral argument rather than a personal one. Lyndhurst begins to move out of the realm of family property and into the realm of cultural artifact. This transition is subtle, but profound. Once something is preserved, it is no longer alive in the way it was intended to be. It is curated. Rooms that once held private conversations are reinterpreted as exhibits. Corridors designed for servants become historical pathways. The house begins to tell a story, but it is no longer the family story alone. It becomes everyone's story, edited and framed for public consumption. The castle survives, but intimacy does not. Opening Lyndhurst to outsiders fundamentally alters its internal logic. Privacy dissolves. Control diffuses. The rhythms of domestic life are replaced by schedules, tours, and protocols. The mansion is no longer governed by need or desire, but by access and interpretation. What was once excess becomes education. What was once burden becomes heritage. Financially, this transformation offers relief but not salvation. Public access offsets costs, but does not erase them. Preservation is expensive. Historic structures demand even more care than private ones. The difference lies in justification. Expenses that once felt indulgent now feel necessary. The castle no longer drains wealth in silence. It demands funding openly, psychologically, This shift reframes failure as stewardship. The family no longer has to explain why they cannot live there. They explain why it must be protected. This reframing is powerful. It allows surrender without shame. Lyndhurst is no longer something they failed to maintain. It is something they chose to preserve for others. Yet this conversion comes with its own cost. The castle's meaning becomes fixed. It is frozen at a particular moment in time, often idealized. The messy realities of maintenance, debt, and exhaustion are smoothed over. Visitors see grandeur, not invoices. They see ambition, not attrition. The very process of preservation risks obscuring the lesson Lyndhurst was meant to teach. The castle becomes an object of nostalgia rather than a warning. Gothic arches and river views invite admiration. The financial and emotional toll that nearly destroyed its owner fades into the background. Lyndhurst survives physically, but its true story risks being domesticated. Still, survival is survival. Many Gilded Age estates were not so fortunate. They were dismantled, subdivided, or left to rot. Lyndhurst's adaptation allows it to endure into a new century. It stands not because it was easy to save, but because it was too significant to lose. This significance, however, is double-edged. By preserving Lyndhurst, society preserves the myth of sustainable excess. The castle becomes proof that monumental ambition can outlast its consequences. But the truth is more complicated. Lyndhurst survived only by abandoning its original purpose. It could not remain a private fortress. It had to become a public memory. In this phase, the mansion exists in a state of careful tension. It must appear timeless while constantly changing behind the scenes. Infrastructure is updated discreetly. Safety measures are installed invisibly. Modern systems are threaded through old stone. The castle adapts, but it hides its adaptation. The illusion of permanence must be maintained. The Hudson continues to flow past its towers, indifferent to these adjustments. The river has seen fortunes rise and fall long before Lyndhurst appeared. In this context, the castle feels both monumental and fragile. It endures, but only through continuous intervention. What is lost in this process is ownership in the deepest sense. No one lives with Lyndhurst anymore. No one wakes to its drafts or listens to its nighttime creaks as a private burden. The castle is visited, not inhabited. It is admired, not endured. The relationship has changed. This transformation completes the arc that began with overconfidence. Lyndhurst was built as a declaration of dominance over time and landscape. It becomes a reminder of time's dominance over ambition. The stone remains, but the meaning shifts. Section 8 reveals the final irony. Lyndhurst did not bankrupt its owner by collapsing. It bankrupted him by surviving. By continuing to demand care long after it ceased to serve its original purpose. By forcing a reckoning that ended not in ruin, but in relinquishment. The castle stands today not as a home, but as a lesson preserved in limestone. It tells a story not just of wealth, but of lineage. Of what happens when vision outpaces sustainability. Of how even the most powerful individuals must eventually negotiate with time. In becoming a public artifact, Lyndhurst is finally honest. It no longer pretends to be livable. It no longer claims to be practical. It exists to be seen, studied, and remembered. And in that role, it fulfills a purpose it could never achieve as a private residence. What remains is the final question. Was Lyndhurst worth it? Was the cost justified by the legacy? In the next section, we will confront that question directly, examining how the mansion's survival reshaped its reputation and how history ultimately judges a house that was too grand to fail, yet too costly to keep. By the time Lyndhurst settled into its role as a preserved monument, history had already begun to soften its edges. Time has a way of forgiving what money cannot. The debts, the strain, the quiet financial exhaustion that once haunted its owner fade into abstraction, replaced by admiration and reverence. This is where Lyndhurst's story becomes most complicated, because survival changes how failure is remembered. What nearly ruined the man is later celebrated as a national treasure. The very scale that once made the estate unbearable becomes the reason it is protected. In the modern imagination, Lyndhurst is no longer discussed as a liability. It is framed as a triumph of American architecture, a jewel of the Hudson Valley, a testament to the ambition of the Gilded Age. Visitors do not arrive prepared to confront collapse. They arrive expecting beauty. They photograph towers, marvel at stained glass, and linger over stories of famous guests. The house performs well in this role. It was designed to impress, and it still does, but reputation is selective. It chooses what to remember and what to omit. The financial reality of Lyndhurst's private years rarely occupies center stage. The constant repairs, the staffing demands, the seasonal costs, the invisible hemorrhaging of capital are relegated to footnotes. This is not dishonesty so much as distance. The further we move from lived experience, the easier it becomes to romanticize. The Gilded Age itself undergoes a similar transformation. Once criticized as a period of grotesque inequality and reckless excess, it is later reframed as an era of elegance and craftsmanship. Mansions like Lyndhurst become symbols of refinement rather than warning signs of imbalance. The social tensions that made such estates unsustainable are smoothed over by nostalgia. History becomes aesthetic. This reframing has consequences. When Lyndhurst is remembered primarily as an architectural masterpiece, its role as a financial cautionary tale weakens. The mansion becomes evidence of vision rather than hubris. Its endurance suggests vindication. Yet endurance, in this case, was achieved through surrender. The house survived by leaving private life behind. The irony is subtle but important. Lyndhurst did not succeed because it was economically sound. It succeeded because others decided it was worth saving. That decision was cultural, not financial. It was based on collective values, not private viability. In that sense, Lyndhurst's survival says more about society's relationship with its past than about the wisdom of its original construction. As preservation institutions take over, the narrative becomes more orderly. The chaos of ownership is replaced by curated interpretation. Plaques explain design choices. Guides recount anecdotes. The story gains coherence but loses friction. Visitors encounter Lyndhurst as a finished product, not an ongoing struggle. The sense of burden is gone, yet if one looks closely, the tension remains embedded in the structure itself. The sheer scale of the rooms, the distance between functions, the excess of ornament all speak quietly of overreach. Lyndhurst is impressive, but it is also inefficient. It was never designed for ease. It was designed for statement. That distinction matters. In this light, the mansion's bankruptcy legacy becomes clearer. Lyndhurst did not fail because its owner was careless or incompetent. It failed because it embodied a philosophy that equated permanence with power. Stone was meant to outlast uncertainty. Grandeur was meant to stabilize reputation. But the world changed faster than the walls could adapt. Industrial fortunes were mobile. Capital shifted. Social norms evolved. The castle remained fixed. Its immobility, once a sign of strength, became a weakness. Lyndhurst could not downsize itself. It could not adjust quietly. It demanded full commitment or abandonment. When history later celebrates Lyndhurst, it often isolates the mansion from this context. It treats the house as an object rather than a process. But Lyndhurst was never just a building. It was an ongoing negotiation between ambition and reality. That negotiation ended only when private ownership withdrew. This withdrawal is often interpreted as generosity or foresight. In truth, it was necessity. The costs had become unjustifiable. Preservation offered an honorable exit. It allowed the owner's legacy to survive even as personal control ended. Reputation was salvaged, if not finances. Over time, this outcome reshapes judgment. Instead of asking whether Lyndhurst was a mistake, history asks whether it was beautiful. Instead of questioning its sustainability, we praise its craftsmanship. These are not invalid questions, but they are incomplete. Beauty does not negate consequence. The lesson Lyndhurst offers is therefore indirect. It does not shout its warning. It whispers it through scale. through corridors that stretch farther than needed, through rooms designed to be seen rather than used, through maintenance systems that never stop demanding attention. The house teaches quietly, for those willing to listen. Modern audiences, accustomed to wealth displayed digitally and temporarily, encounter Lyndhurst as something alien. Its physicality feels excessive in an era of flexibility. In that sense, the mansion regains some of its original power, not as aspiration, but as contrast. It shows what happens when wealth tries to anchor itself permanently in stone. This contrast is where Lyndhurst's reputation becomes most honest. It is neither pure success nor pure failure. It is evidence. Evidence of how values shape architecture. Evidence of how architecture shapes obligation. Evidence of how legacy can outlive intention. In public memory, Lyndhurst is often grouped with other surviving estates, forming a collective image of aristocratic America. But each of these houses has its own economic story. Lyndhurst is distinctive because of how closely survival followed collapse. The line between the two is thin. The mansion stands today because it crossed that line at the right moment. Had it waited longer, decay might have won. Had it surrendered earlier, its story might have been forgotten. Timing, as much as design, determined its fate. This realization reframes the idea of bankruptcy itself. Financial ruin does not always mean disappearance. Sometimes it means transformation. Sometimes it means losing ownership while retaining presence. Lyndhurst lost one to keep the other. As history continues to reinterpret the Gilded Age, Lyndhurst remains a touchstone. It invites admiration while quietly resisting simplification. It refuses to be only a fairy tale castle or only a cautionary ruin. It occupies the uncomfortable space in between, and that is precisely where its value lies. Not in pretending that such ambition was harmless, nor in condemning it outright, but in preserving the evidence of what it cost. The stone walls do not apologize. They endure. In the next and final section, we will step back from the structure itself and consider the broader legacy Lyndhurst leaves behind, what it ultimately teaches about wealth, ambition, and the fine line between building a monument and becoming trapped inside one. When the story of Lyndhurst finally reaches its end, it does not do so with collapse, scandal, or erasure. It ends with reflection. The castle still stands on its rise above the Hudson River, its towers cutting into the sky with the same confidence they possessed more than a century ago. But confidence, like stone, can outlast understanding. What Lyndhurst represents now is not the triumph its builders imagined, but the accumulated meaning of everything that followed: the strain, the surrender, and the uneasy survival. Lyndhurst forces a confrontation with a difficult truth about wealth. Money can build almost anything, but it cannot freeze time. The men who commissioned and expanded the estate believed permanence could be purchased. They believed that by embedding their success into the landscape, they could outlast the volatility of markets, politics, and public opinion. For a moment it worked. Lyndhurst became a symbol of arrival, of authority, of belonging among the most powerful figures of the Gilded Age. But symbols demand maintenance, and maintenance demands submission. The house did not merely reflect power. It consumed it. This is the legacy that often escapes casual admiration. Lyndhurst was never just expensive to build. It was expensive to continue believing in. Every year the estate existed as a private home. It required its owner to reaffirm a commitment that grew more irrational over time. What began as ambition slowly transformed into obligation. To walk away would have meant admitting that grandeur had limits. To stay meant accepting a slow financial erosion. The mansion offered no graceful middle ground. In this way, Lyndhurst becomes a case study in how success can trap its creator. The estate's very visibility made retreat impossible. Smaller homes can be sold quietly, abandoned discreetly, or altered without scrutiny. Lyndhurst was too conspicuous for that. Its presence on the Hudson announced its owner's status to the world. Letting it go meant relinquishing not just property, but identity. When that relinquishment finally occurred, it marked a broader cultural shift. The era that produced Lyndhurst had already ended. Industrial fortunes were no longer displayed through castles but through corporations, stocks, and influence. Wealth became abstract, mobile, and discrete. The old language of power stone, land, and spectacle no longer translated. Lyndhurst belonged to a world that had stopped speaking its dialect, yet history does not discard such artifacts easily. Instead, it repurposes them. Lyndhurst's transition into a preserved estate allows society to admire the ambition of the past without bearing its cost. Visitors experience the grandeur without inheriting the burden. This separation is both a gift and a distortion. It keeps the structure alive while dulling the lessons embedded in its excess. Still, the lesson remains for those willing to look beyond surface beauty. Lyndhurst demonstrates how architecture can outgrow its usefulness. It shows how personal vision, when scaled too large, becomes inflexible. The castle could not adapt to changing financial realities because it was never designed to. It was built to endure, not to adjust. This rigidity is what ultimately bankrupted its owner, not in a single dramatic moment, but through prolonged resistance to change. The mansion demanded consistency in a world defined by transformation. As taxes rose, labor costs increased, and social norms shifted, Lyndhurst remained unmoved. Its stone walls did not negotiate. They simply waited. There is also a quieter legacy embedded in the house, the emotional toll of maintaining such an environment. Living inside a monument is not the same as living in a home. Scale alters intimacy. Grandeur amplifies isolation. Lyndhurst's rooms were designed to impress others, not to comfort their occupants. Over time, this imbalance becomes draining. The house was impressive, but it was not forgiving. When modern audiences walk through Lyndhurst today, they sense this, even if they cannot articulate it. The beauty is undeniable, but so is the distance. The house does not invite closeness. It commands attention. That command is what once justified its cost, and what eventually made it untenable. In the broader story of the Gilded Age, Lyndhurst occupies a critical position. It is neither the largest nor the most ornate of its peers, but its survival allows us to examine the full life cycle of such ambition. From aspiration to dominance, from dominance to burden, from burden to preservation. Few estates complete this arc so clearly. The final legacy of Lyndhurst is therefore not architectural, but philosophical. It challenges the assumption that bigger is safer, that permanence equals security, that visibility ensures relevance. The mansion disproves each of these ideas. Its size magnified its vulnerability. Its permanence delayed necessary change. Its visibility made retreat costly, and yet Lyndhurst also demonstrates the resilience of meaning. Stripped of its original function, the house found a new one. It became a vessel for memory, education, and reflection. This transformation does not redeem the excess that built it, but it reframes it. The mansion's value now lies not in what it provided its owner, but in what it offers those who come after. What Lyndhurst ultimately teaches is restraint through retrospect. It allows future generations to observe the consequences of unchecked ambition without repeating them. The castle stands as a material argument for balance, reminding us that legacy is not defined by scale alone, but by sustainability. The Hudson River continues to flow past its grounds unchanged by the house's presence. Empires rise and fall along its banks, just as they always have. Lyndhurst remains, not as a claim of dominance, but as a witness. It watches eras pass, silently cataloging the cost of trying to outbuild time. In the end, Lyndhurst did not fail because it was poorly built or badly imagined. It failed because it succeeded too well at expressing a worldview that could not survive its own consequences. The bankruptcy it caused was not simply financial. It was philosophical. It marked the moment when monumental private ambition collided with modern reality. Standing before the castle today, one can admire the craftsmanship, the vision, the audacity. But admiration should be accompanied by understanding. Lyndhurst is not a fantasy preserved in stone. It is a story written in limestone and debt, in aspiration and surrender. That is its final truth. Not that greatness is impossible, but that it carries weight. Weight that must be carried every day, long after the applause fades. Lyndhurst carried that weight until it could no longer be borne privately. And in doing so, it left behind one of the clearest, most enduring lessons of the Gilded Age, that the line between legacy and liability is thinner than it appears. And once crossed, it is rarely visible until it is too late.